listeners. Welcome to the 33rd lecture in this NPTEL course on 20th century women's novels. I have been discussing the life and work of Elizabeth Bowen. In this lecture, I will continue the discussion of the context and wrap up our study of this novelist by reading some quotes from her writing. But before that, I want to continue to clarify exactly how Bowen's birth and upbringing in the Anglo-Irish community is crucial to helping us understand how the emotional moods of her novels is created and how and why we can actually call the fictional oeuvre of Elizabeth Bowen, her novels and short stories taken as a whole, we can call them the creation of a structure of feeling. I read out from her autobiographical memoir, Bowen's Court, and specifically two sentences in which Bowen draws a parallel between children, specifically orphans and lonely or single children, and the Anglo-Irish community as a whole. And I'll read those quotes out again and go about explaining how these two sentences help us understand the way Elizabeth Bowen reconciles herself to something very unfair, but is very clear, is very objective about the kind of privilege that she inherits, and takes a lot of pains to show how that privilege is actually not what it may seem to be. So, the final emotional mood that we get from Bowen's fiction is that of privilege, but tinged with an undeniable sense of vulnerability. And it's a very strange combination. In fact, one can say that it is quite presumptuous of a novelist to claim that despite the privileges that she inherits, there is something vulnerable in it. An awareness and an understanding of this strange coexistence of privilege and vulnerability is necessary to enjoying and appreciating Elizabeth Bowen's novels. And that awareness, that understanding can come from knowing a little bit about the history of this Anglo-Irish community and specifically how Elizabeth Bowen related to it. It was a history that was very well known. It was very political. Everyone had an opinion. It was quite easy to hold a very strong opinion about the injustice or the unfairness of the privilege that the Anglo-Irish community wielded. But Elizabeth Bowen's view as a novelist was not simply this very public view. And so, by understanding what Bowen felt and how she described that feeling about the privilege wielded by the Anglo-Irish community, we will get a sense of how the novels operate and what kind of world the novels are creating. So first, those two quotes about how the Anglo-Irish people are like children. Bowen writes, "The existences of Anglo-Irish people, like those of only children, are singular, independent, and secretive. Further, to most of the rest of the world, we are semi-strangers, for whom existence has something of the trance-like quality of a spectacle." So both these sentences attribute some very clear qualities, some very clear traits to two kinds of entities. First is a biological entity, that is, human beings when they are young, that is, when they have not yet reached the level of maturity, understanding, physical strength, but also social and cultural awareness, which is necessary to create an independent existence in the world. Basically, human beings in a state of needing care, in a state that if they are left to fend for themselves, will probably not survive. This is a condition that every human being goes through. And so this is one category. The other is not a biological category of the human, but rather an ethnic and regional as well as linguistic category. This is the category of the Anglo-Irish community. And a little bit of history. So who are these Anglo-Irish people? The Anglo-Irish community is that community of Protestants who, from the 18th century in England began to receive favors from King Henry, from the British crown, because of the religious controversy unfolding in the monarchy of England. So the Protestant community, they received the influence, the benefits, material power and privilege from the British crown, which meant that the majority of the Irish people who happened to be Catholic were pushed into poverty and a relative lack of affluence. So the Anglo-Irish community has been privileged, but this material privilege has come at the cost of a kind of lack of social respect and reputation. So while they enjoyed privilege, there was also, depending on the context, a sense that they were occupying privilege, they were occupying comforts and power at the expense of someone else who might have deserved it equally, but who, because of a certain accident of history, were denied those privileges. In a very, very brief nutshell, this is the history of the Anglo Irish community. And the claim that Bowen is making is that from the perspective of the early 20th century, this community, whose existence spans a longer period of time, about 3 centuries, can be described as that of children. And specifically, children, this is implied but not said, specifically, children in large houses or the big house, which in Ireland was a way of referring to English middle class villas, specifically in London. So, a lot of late 19th and early 20th century Irish literature will use the expression big house. Big houses refer to English houses. Children in big houses, one is claiming, occupy this combination of privilege and vulnerability. Now, it's clear where the Anglo-Irish community's privilege comes from. But where does its vulnerability come from? Now, the claim here, and which the rest of the book will clarify, the book being Bowen's Court, is that many members of this Anglo-Irish community, while they inherited property and privilege, they actually failed to keep it up. And this failure was both due to the lack of material resources, but also due to poor decisions, due to the common mistakes of sin, greed, illicit sexual affairs, and gambling, and other forms in which they managed to squander the privilege and the properties that they had inherited. As a result, at the time that Bowen was writing, this community did not, in fact, enjoy any unambiguous form of privilege. And this is the point that Bowen would like to make. How to adequately and appropriately sympathize with or criticize, because both are necessary, how to inhabit the right critical stance towards this community, which was both privileged and vulnerable. So this is the first claim. The other claim is that both these two kinds of human beings, that is, the biological category of children and the regional, ethnic, and linguistic category of Anglo-Irish people, appear strange to the world, and their existence has a trance-like quality of a spectacle, meaning that what is true about both these categories of human beings is that to external observers, they may look like they have a certain kind of existence, but beyond the surface, just beneath the surface, there is something else that is going on. So these two things are very important for us to note, and we will see that those of you who will take the time to actually read through the novel will find that this awareness that vulnerability and privilege have both historical as well as biological sources actually helps unlock a great deal of what feels compelling, but also what feels powerful, and ultimately what remains the most memorable aspect of reading Elizabeth Bowen's fiction. Now, what does Bowen's Court do as a book? Now, Bowen's court makes this very clear narrative. It demonstrates that a lot of stereotypes about the Anglo-Irish community, these stereotypes were actually fact for the ancestors of this novelist, that is Elizabeth Bowen. So, what are these cliches or these stereotypes? So, the big house builders, as they were known to be obsessed with self aggrandizement and self perpetuation. They were known to have orgies of hunting and drinking. They were known to be embroiled in endless lawsuits and deeds of sale. They were known to indulge in marriages for money. They were known to have a lot of interbreeding between the gentry and the locals. They were known to have a lot of absentee landlords. They were known to have a lot of usurping agents. And they were also known to enjoy a sort of decadent and debauched high life in Dublin before the Union. So these were actually cliches, but Bowen makes the effort to clarify that these cliches emerged from realities, and there was a hint, there was a seed of each of these cliches as being a real event in Bowen's family's history. So, and the novelist's contribution, the novelist is a very keen perceiver of emotions. If one uses a term that is quite popular these days with corporate speak on leadership, then novelists were chroniclers of emotional intelligence before emotional intelligence became a part of corporate speak. So, or what kind of emotional intelligence does Bowen bring to this chronicle of cliched, misbehaving, Irish absentee landlords? Now, Elizabeth Bowen's contribution is that she brings to this history and a tradition of unawareness. The Bowens in Elizabeth Bowen's narrative were largely oblivious of their ambivalent position in Ireland. They seem to exist like children in a blissfully innocent state of the larger historical and political context in which they had earned their privileges. And so, in a way, the emotional arc that Elizabeth Bowen herself, as a writer, as an autobiographer, traverses in Bowen's court is very similar to the kind of emotional arc that a lot of Bildungsroman novels traverse with respect to the evolution of the child protagonist from innocence to experience. The Anglo-Irish community is like the child protagonist of a Bildungsroman narrative, except that in this case, the community, the successive generations of Elizabeth Bowen's ancestors, they are not alive to witness this transformation. Elizabeth Bowen herself alone is the representative, and in her writing, she traverses this transition from innocence to experience. Elizabeth Bowen is that member of the Anglo Irish community who is not unaware, who writes about the experience of being unaware from the perspective of an almost painful awareness. Elizabeth Bowen herself is painfully aware because she struggled to hold on to the ownership of Bowen's Court. In fact, I think I mentioned this in the previous lecture, but this house, while inherited in the late 18th century and while being quite large and quite spacious, was actually very poorly built. And due to the financial constraints and the struggles of the family, it was not updated in the 20th century. And it was after the success that Bowen had after publishing a few novels that she was able to add two modern bathrooms to this house. And ultimately, she was forced to sell it off. And even though she hoped that the owner would preserve the house, she learned that the owner simply wanted the land and the wood. So, this is a very painful, very realistic awareness of the kind of privilege which itself was dying that the Anglo Irish community possessed. And so, Bowen writes from the perspective of realistic knowledge that this privilege would not last. And from that awareness, she describes as empathetically as possible the experiences, the tendencies, the eccentricities, the decadence of this community. Now, I'll read some more quotations from Bowen's quote in order to help explain the complexity of the position that Elizabeth Bowen occupies. So I'll provide some context from Hermione Lee's critical account of Elizabeth Bowen's work. And Lee mentions that despite all of this ironic awareness of the complexity of this privilege, ultimately Bowen's perspective leans towards the conservative. And I'm bound to agree with Hermione Lee because Lee provides a very persuasive account of the entirety of Bowen's fictional and non fictional oeuvre. So, what does this conservatism mean? This conservatism manifests itself in certain positions that Bowen took with regard to the relationships between England and Ireland. And I'll read briefly from Hermione Lee now. For all her ironic objectivity, she, that is Bowen, endorses most of the political assumptions of the Protestant ascendancy. She, that is Bowen, laments the acts of the Union, which she regards as a bad deal, and shares in the usual Anglo-Irish nostalgia for their late 18th century heyday, the time of Grattan's Parliament and the volunteers, and so on. So there is, theoretically speaking, an essential conservatism in Bowen's perspective. And this is a strain that I would like to highlight because it will remain in the tradition of novelists that I have selected for study in this course. Conservatism is an important idea. Conservatism must not be dismissed simply as an undesirable or fruitless, politically speaking, assumption. Conservatism in the 20th century was an important vehicle for channeling different ways of thinking about identity. And especially when it comes to the writing of several powerful Anglophone women novelists, we can identify a group of writers who self consciously identified as being part of a politically conservative position. Now, in this group, we can place Elizabeth Bowen, but we can also place other writers such as Virginia Woolf, as we also can place Iris Murdoch, who will be the next novelist we will discuss. Now, what does it mean for these writers to be conservative? This idea of conservatism has a very different idea from what conservatism might mean today. Now, it's important to note that a lot of these writers were at the forefront of the suffrage movement. That is, they all very powerfully championed the right of women to vote with or without owning property. And so that's a very clear example of how conservatism in this context does not mean conservative as it would mean in the 21st century. Conservative in this context means certain assumptions about nations and certain notions about property. Now, a lot of these women writers were able to produce the intellectual labor of writing novels, and not just novels that gave escapist pleasure, but novels that created very powerful structures of feeling, novels that represented in very meticulous ways the passage of important historical events, novels that staged important philosophical debates about the relationship between men and women, about the kinds of unions that could be existed between individuals and the state, between men and women, between husbands and wives, and so on. So these novels were actually very powerful intellectual documents. And these women writers were able to produce these acts of intellectual labor through a kind of privilege which very often stemmed from their ownership of property or from their favorable position and their strong allegiances to both the British nation, that is, England, with all of its colonial and imperial interests. So, this is a very diffused, somewhat unconscious, but it is nonetheless a very, very undeniable form of conservatism. And we must acknowledge this and we must accept this because it seems very easy sometimes to dismiss a particular action or a particular statement made by an individual as a wholesale dismissal of their commitment to changing the world or their commitment to seeing a more equal world. Now, to be clear, all of these women novelists were very strongly committed to seeing a more equal world. In fact, it is through their powerful observations of inequality within the privileged English household that commitment to a more equal society is manifested. However, they were also known to make, sometimes in private, sometimes in public, statements which today might appear to support the inequalities of the relations between, let's say, England and Ireland, or between England and other parts of the world, between England and its many colonial regions and territories. And so that's what makes Elizabeth Bowen an essentially conservative writer, which is her very clear affinity to the financial and political power that England held over Ireland. And one very philosophical and intellectual manner in which this conservatism manifested was in the way that Elizabeth Bowen writes about property. And again, I'm leaning on Hermione Lee, who identifies the parallel between Elizabeth Bowen's thinking about property and Edmund Burke's thinking about property. I'll read the quote from Edmund Burke first and then read the quote from Bowen to help understand what this affinity is. So, this is what Burke writes: "The desire for acquisition is always a passion of long views. Confine a man to monetary possession, and you at once cut off that laudable avarice which every wise state has cherished as one of the first principles of its greatness. Allow a man but a temporary possession, lay it down as a maxim that he can never have any other, and you immediately and infallibly turn him to temporary enjoyments. These enjoyments are never the pleasures of labor and free industry, whose quality it is to famish the present hours and squander all upon prospect and futurity. They are, on the contrary, those of a thoughtless, loitering, and dissipated life." So the point that Edmund Burke is making, which is also the point that Adam Smith makes and other thinkers, other 18th century thinkers about the nature of capitalism, the nature of labor, which is that property has a greater good. The idea here is that more than wages, what's more important is property. Wages are temporary, but property is the transmutation or the synthesis of liquid cash into capital because it grows over time. Essentially speaking, this is part of the many intellectual voices which Marx criticizes as capital in his treatise Das Kapital. So, what is Burke's point here? Burke, like Adam Smith and Ricardo and several others in the 18th and 19th centuries, defended the deferral of gratification and justified capitalism by leaning on an understanding of human psychology. The understanding of psychology here is that immediate gratification is bad, but deferred gratification is good because ultimately it will make human beings happier. And from this understanding of psychology, Burke creates a justification for capitalism, for property. Property is good because it inspires people to work for the betterment of society. And this is what Burke means by laudable avarice. Avarice can be good and bad. The greed for wages or salaries or money is not a laudable avarice, but the love for property in this view is a laudable avarice. So this is Edmund Burke. This is a thought that's articulated roughly at the time that the British Crown grants this big house to Bowen's great grandfather. And I'll now read a quote from Elizabeth Bowen, writing in the middle of the 20th century, in 1942, in the middle of the London Blitz. This is what Elizabeth Bowen writes. For these people, my family and their associates, the idea of power was mostly vested in property. Property having been acquired by use or misuse of power in the first place. One may say that while property lasted the dangerous power, ideas stayed, like a sword in its scabbard, fairly safely at rest. At least, property gave my people, and people like them, the means to exercise power in a direct, concrete, and therefore limited way. I submit that the power-loving temperament is more dangerous when it either prefers or is forced to operate in what is materially a void. We have everything to dread from the dispossessed. So this is a very telling account and a telling diagnosis of the emotional troubles that would plague this Anglo-Irish community after the loss of their privilege. But it's also a very insightful understanding of the kind of politics that this community had come to possess and the kind of politics that they descended into once they lost property. The assumption here is that property allows the misuse of power to be contained and to be expended in a somewhat harmless manner. So, property means that people who probably don't know how to use power will end up not harming others. They'll probably only harm themselves. And therefore, they are not that much of a danger to society. But what happens when, due to historical circumstances, and in this case, the history was the freedom and the self-determination of the Irish people. So once the Irish self-rule and home rule movement began to gain power and began to assert itself, this privilege that the Anglo-Irish people enjoyed no longer held. Being Anglo-Irish Protestant was no longer such a powerful thing because it was Irishness which became more universally powerful than any particular sectarian or ethnic variant of Irishness. Okay? So the loss of the unique privilege and with it property that being Protestant and Irish gave to this community led to the loss of property. And the loss of property meant that these people began to misuse their power in ways that began to have an impact on other people. And this is what Bowen ends with, is the sentence, we have everything to dread from the dispossessed. This fear, this awareness that those who are dispossessed are actually dangerous. This is also an important idea to help understand Bowen's fiction. Who is dispossessed? A person or a community who once had power and property are aware of what it means, what it feels to have power and property, but are now forced to exist without that feeling of power and property and with the desire for that feeling of having power and property. This is the dispossessed. And Elizabeth Bowen's insight in this memoir is that we must fear the dispossessed more now that they are dispossessed. That the feeling of being dispossessed that is transmuted from cultural and ethnic categories to emotional and biological and sometimes personal categories in the novel. Elizabeth Bowen's novels are full of dispossessed people. They're full of human beings who are enervated by strange and sometimes strange to people around them emotional forces. What are these forces? Sometimes they are the betrayal by one's own family. Sometimes they are the awareness that people are not as innocent as one believes or feels or naturally wants them to be. So Elizabeth Bowen's novels are full of such characters. I will continue this discussion in the next lecture and wrap up our discussion of Bowen and move on to the next novelist in this course, which is Iris Murdoch. Thank you.